World War I was fought between 1914 and 1918 and resulted in the deaths of millions of people. The war broke out in Europe and had several long-term causes, often referred to as the main causes of World War I. These causes include militarism, a system of alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Americans managed to stay out of the frenzy for 3 years before intervening on the side of the Allies and bringing an end to the devastating war in just over a year. Unfortunately, the role of African Americans was greatly restricted in the U.S. by racism and segregation. Right after U.S. entry into World War I in July of 1917, some 15,000 African Americans marched silently down Fifth Avenue in New York to protest Jim Crow laws and lynchings in the South. The president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, refused to integrate the armed forces. In fact, Wilson's fight against the Central Powers in Europe was the epitome of hypocrisy, as this was a man who screened the film The Birth of a Nation, which glorified the KKK, and refused to support a desperately needed federal anti-lynching bill. Amazingly, though their country treated them as second-class citizens, thousands of African Americans volunteered for service when the war broke out. African American leaders actually encouraged their followers to enlist so that by fighting for freedom and democracy abroad, they could help to achieve it more rapidly at home. Today we'll look at 3 examples of African Americans who fought viciously for a country that was not yet ready to fight for them. Henry Johnson. Henry Johnson was the most famous member of the Harlem Hellfighters, an all-black National Guard unit that was among the first American forces to arrive in Europe during World War I. Johnson and his fellow African American soldiers spent their early days in the war performing unskilled manual labor before being sent to reinforce the depleted ranks of the French army. On May 14, 1918, Johnson and another Hellfighter named Needham Roberts were serving sentry duty in the Argonne Forest. Just after 2 a.m., the duo was attacked by a detachment of some 20 German troops. Both men had soon been wounded, Roberts so severely that he was unable to stand or shoot. But Johnson held fast and fought back with hand grenades and his rifle. Despite being shot several times, he returned fire until his weapon jammed, then used it as a club and fought hand-to-hand until it broke into pieces. When Johnson saw that the Germans were trying to take Roberts prisoner, he drew his one remaining weapon, a bolo knife, and slashed and stabbed several men until the raiding party finally fell back. When the dust cleared, Johnson had inflicted at least a dozen casualties on the Germans and suffered 21 wounds from gunfire and bayonets. Both he and Roberts were later given the Croix de Guerre, one of France's highest military honors, but Johnson's heroic stand went unrewarded in the United States until 1996. Eugene Bullard. Before the war began, Bullard moved to Paris, where he made a reputation for himself as a professional boxer. At the start of the war in 1914, Bullard enlisted in the French Foreign Legion, where he was assigned to the 170th Infantry Regiment. Nicknamed the Swallows of Death, he and his unit would see heavy action, and during the Battle of Verdun, Bullard was wounded twice. He was then sent to a Parisian hospital to recuperate for the next 6 months. Bullard was promoted to the rank of corporal and was awarded the Croix de Guerre and other wartime medals for his bravery during combat. While still in the hospital, Bullard accepted a bet that he couldn't get into the Flying Corps, and in October of 1916, he arrived at French Gunnery School. A month later, he talked his way into pilot training and earned his pilot's license to become the first African American aviator. He reached the front lines as a pilot in August of 1917, flying more than 20 missions in a Spad 7 fighter biplane with 2 unconfirmed kills to his credit. When he returned to the U.S., he was never recognized as a war hero and died in relative obscurity and poverty in Queens, New York. While he never realized his dream of becoming a pilot in the U.S. military, he was finally recognized as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Air Force in 1994. Freddie Stowers. A South Carolina native, Stowers was killed in action on September 28, 1918, during an assault on Hill 188. On that day, he and his company were ordered to take the heavily fortified hill, fighting through mortar rounds and a hail of gunfire from the Germans. The defense of the hill was so vicious that every ranking officer in Stowers' platoon was killed, leaving the corporal in command of his rifle squad as they continued the assault on Hill 188. He rallied the remaining troops and pushed forward, but was struck by an enemy machine gun. That didn't stop him, and he continued forward, leading his men on. He was struck a second time, but he still kept pushing his men forward, and his act of valor in the face of imminent death inspired them to surge ahead and take out the remaining German defenders to take the hill. Stowers never made it off that hill, succumbing to the overwhelming blood loss suffered from his multiple bullet wounds. The corporal in the 371st Infantry wasn't rewarded for his deeds until 70 years after his death, when he awarded the Medal of Honor.